Do you think so? Yeah, but it's just. Hi, may I have your attention? Good evening and welcome. Is it on? Is it? Yeah, is it on? I don't know anything about gizmos.
It's not amplifying, it's recording or broadcasting.
So I'm okay? Oh, okay. Well, good evening and welcome. It's great to have everyone here in person, the first time we've hosted a meeting here in 3 years, and to all of those who are viewing on WinCam. Tonight's program features Dan McKanan, and he will discuss the forest festivals that spurred 19th century Bostonians to protect their green spaces. Dan is the Emerson Senior Lecturer at Harvard Divinity School, where he has taught since 2008. He is the author of 6 books on religious and spiritual activism on behalf of peace, justice, economic cooperation, and ecological harmony. Dan's research on the forest festivals is part of a much larger project exploring the late 19th century movement to preserve wild spaces throughout metropolitan Boston. As part of that research, he has walked through most of the spaces that were preserved as a result of the Metropolitan Park Commission legislation of 1893. But the Middlesex Fells, yay, remains his favorite hiking space. And Dan, the podium is yours.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be with all of you as you return to in-person gatherings, and I'm just so impressed that this community has such a strong tradition of gathering to think about the past and how it can be a source of inspiration for the future. Today I will be sharing a very local story about the preservation of Middlesex Fells. But I'd like to begin by telling you about the broader environmental vision that informs my historical research. We live in the midst of one of the great periods of mass extinction in the history of planet Earth. Nearly 200 species go extinct each day, mostly as a result of deforestation. It isn't just individual species, entire ecosystems are going extinct. The scale of the loss is unfathomable, felt by human families who see their farmland destroyed by drought or flooding, by nations that see their land sink under the sea, and by fireflies and sequoias and polar bears. Amid this tragedy, we have an important source of hope. It is possible to restore biodiversity. It isn't possible to resurrect an extinct species, of course, but it is possible to return species and ecosystems from the brink of extinction. It's possible for a landscape to become more hospitable year after year to a wider array of plants and animals, fungi and bacteria. The only hope for planet Earth is one in which people work with our more than human kin to foster greater biodiversity in every landscape. It's not enough just to protect pristine landscapes. We must restore biodiversity in the places where we live, work, and play. And that restoration means all of us working together. Now, how about that? Now, I imagine that many of you would like to hope for this, but you aren't sure it's truly possible. If so, you are lucky to be living in metropolitan Boston, and specifically in a community that borders Middlesex Fells. You're lucky because what I've just been describing has already happened here. 150 years ago, on the land where we are now, people began to recognize the intertwined threats of climate change and biodiversity loss. They realized that the loss of forests would lead to the loss of water, and thus to devastating changes for plants and animals. They took action together to protect the remaining pockets of forest and to return forest to places where it had been destroyed. And so when you take a walk in Middlesex Fells, and notice a bird or flower or tree that you'd never seen before. Or when you walk along the mystic lakes beside migrating herring, you're already experiencing the best hope for our planet's future. And I'm here to tell you the story of how this began. Most of the story I have to share took place in the final decades of the 19th century, the years when Middlesex Fells became a protected forest. But I'd like to start a little bit earlier, about 200 years ago. This was roughly 200 years after the beginning of British colonial settlement in Massachusetts. Oops, sorry, getting used to that. And 200 years is the lifespan of the white pine, dominant species in Middlesex Fells. A pine cone that fell in the forest 200 years ago might be a mature tree today. A fully mature tree 200 years ago might have been a seedling when white settlers first arrived in Winchester. But you and your ancestors would be hard-pressed to find either of the trees I just described, because by 1823, Massachusetts was almost entirely deforested, and its mostly treeless state persisted for half a century. There weren't many mature white pines in 1823, at least not in the Boston area, and very few seedlings from that time have made it to our own. 200 years is also roughly 7 human generations. Most of us know little about our 7th generation ancestors. When we were very young, our great-grandparents might have told us about their great-grandparents, but that doesn't get us to 7 generations. Some of us live very far from where our ancestors lived. That's different from the people I'll talk about today. Mostly, they lived in the Boston area, and their ancestors 7 generations before had been the first white settlers in this area. So when they saw a mature white pine, they could think, perhaps my great-great-great-great-grandmother touched the top of this tree when it was just a seedling. But again, it wasn't likely to happen because there were so few mature white pines. Part of the ecological web that might have connected their families to the land had been broken, which might be one reason why so many of them scattered away from here in the generations that followed. As descendants of settler colonialists, the people I'm talking about had inherited a legacy of white supremacy, of genocide against indigenous communities, and of violence against the land. Their ancestors had cut white pine to provide masts for the sailing ships that carried kidnapped Africans to the Caribbean. Plantation-produced sugar to the distilleries of Massachusetts, and New England rum back to Africa. Those ancestors had farmed unsustainably, depleting soil fertility that had accumulated over thousands of years. But some of the people in Massachusetts in the 19th century were beginning to imagine a different way of relating to their land. In their own way, these early Massachusetts conservationists were discovering an insight that had long been held sacred by the Haudenosaunee people of the white pine forests to our west. You may have heard the admonition in every deliberation we consider the impact on the next 7 generations. This is a paraphrase by Chief Oren Lyons of the great law of the Haudenosaunee Confederation. In the opening passage of that law, a leader plants the tree of great peace and immediately invites others to sit under its shade and rely on the long-distance vision of an eagle perched in its upper branches. The image underscores the connection between humans and other species, as well as the capacity of trees to expand our imagination to the past and future. Oops. To learn not by rote, but instead be guided to discover the truth through free exploration, especially out in nature. To ensure that her sons would be educated in this way, Cleveland established a village academy and hosted a regular salon for educators and parents. Many of the people who met in Lancaster would later make their mark on American conservation. The Cleveland son Horace was one of the first landscape architects. He designed Sleepy Hollow in Concord and the Minneapolis network of parks that was very precious to me when I lived there. Teacher Elizabeth Peabody later gained fame as the founder of the American kindergarten. Another teacher, Jared Sparks, later served as president of Harvard and was the father-in-law of the founder of the Appalachian Mountain Club. But the person I want to tell you about now is a teacher who then became the first person to raise the alarm that human activity was changing the climate of North America. This was George Barrell Emerson, whose distant cousin, Ralph Waldo, unfortunately gets more credit for his role in American environmentalism. George Emerson was in love with plants long before he got to Lancaster. As a child, he learned the Linnaean names for local plants. As a Harvard student, he studied the university's new botanical collections. Teaching in Lancaster, he found that his eye strain was relieved if he rode his horse every morning along the banks of the Nashua River. He came to believe that the elms and hickories of Lancaster are finer than I've seen in any other part of Massachusetts. From Lancaster, he went on to develop a progressive curriculum for Boston's English high school. His main idea was that everything in nature has moral lessons to teach. A tree was more than a tall growing thing to be used for fuel or lumber. It was one of the noblest and most beautiful of God's works, rising toward heaven, as should our prayers, bringing the influence of the clouds upon the earth, sheltering cattle beneath its shade, and birds in its branches. Emerson thought that children should be taught to regard every place they walked as a temple. In keeping with these ideas, Emerson co-founded the Boston Society of Natural History. When the society took on a huge project for the state government, a survey of all the plants and animals in Massachusetts, George Emerson took responsibility for the volume on trees. He spent 9 summers visiting shipyards, sawmills, and forests, as well as distributing surveys to landowners. The end result was a milestone in conservation history. Emerson's prose blended scientific rigor with direct observation. Again and again, he sounded the alarm. A few generations ago, an almost unbroken forest covered the continent. Now those old woods are everywhere falling. The axe has made and is making wanton and terrible havoc. The new settler clears in a year more acres than he can cultivate in 10, and destroys at a single burning many a winter's fuel, which would be better kept in reserve for his grandchildren. Notice how he's thinking about generations. Emerson had a remarkable sense of what would be lost if Massachusetts lost its forests. It wasn't just that the state would lose fuel, building materials, and maple syrup. Emerson understood that forests also create soil by breaking down hard rocks, contributing organic matter, and preventing erosion. He observed that trees, quote, equalize the temperature and soften the climate, protecting from the extremes of cold and heat, dryness and humidity. In other words, Emerson understood that deforestation would lead to climate change by disrupting the water cycle. He learned this idea from European scientists, but as far as I can tell, he was the first to apply it to North America. He also had a practical plan. He calculated that almost half the acreage in Massachusetts was neither cultivated nor built on, but that only 1/3 of that territory was woodland. That left more than 1 million acres that could readily be reforested. He was especially interested in places like Middlesex Fells, rocky hills that had once been home to majestic pine trees, but had rapidly lost soil after being logged. He also insisted that forest health depends on the variety of species in the forest. And Emerson tugged on the heartstrings of New England readers. It might seem unimportant, he admitted, to reclaim or render valuable the waste or worthless lands of Massachusetts when millions more acres were available further west. But this is our native land, he insisted, and it's painful to break the chain of affection which connects us to it. Painful to see your children go to more fertile grounds elsewhere. Emerson's goal was really to break the cycle of settler colonialism, the cycle where people are always looking for new lands to appropriate for their own temporary benefit. These warnings gradually took root, and by the time of the Civil War, many people in Massachusetts recognized that deforestation was a serious problem. By this time, landscape architects were promoting the idea that parks are essential to health and well-being for urban populations. But even places like Central Park in New York or Boston's Emerald Necklace were highly manicured and made extensive use of non-native tree species. The next step was to put the deforestation idea and the park idea together by creating large parks of hundreds or thousands of acres to be managed in such a way as to allow the original forest to return through natural processes. These parks were the brainchild of a trio of friends. These were John Owen, Wilson Flagg, and Eliza Wright. I only have pictures of two of them. Reforesting metropolitan Boston was their retirement passion, and apparently they made quite an impression. One ally wrote that at every park meeting, these three old men of patriarchal aspect sat leaning toward each other with long gray locks and gray beards flowing, making the observer feel that he had been admitted to some weird council of old Greek wood gods, displaced and belated, not yet quite convinced that Pan was dead, and playing together to save the last remnants of the forests they loved. Not only do I not have a picture of John Owen, I don't know that much about him. He didn't put many of his ideas about the forest into print. But he did help preserve a little bit of the Charles River, or the Charles River front, by donating 3 acres of salt marsh to Harvard College. I haven't figured out which exact part of the riverfront this is. Owen's friend Wilson Flagg was a nature writer who, according to one sketch, belonged to the Thoreau School of American Writers. Really, Flagg joined that school before Thoreau did. He grew up on the North Shore and briefly attended Harvard, but, quote, his love of nature and independent tastes in reading and study could not brook the regularities of academic life. And he obtained an honorable dismissal from college at the end of 3 months. After a similar experience with medical school, he set on a walking tour that took him to Tennessee and Virginia, perhaps along some of the same routes that are now part of the Appalachian Trail. Flagg eventually settled down in Cambridge, where he continued to be a regular walker for pleasure or physical profit into his late 70s. Flagg made his living by writing books and articles about New England forests. In 1838, for example, he introduced readers to the practice of descriptive phenology, or tracing the dates when different wildflowers sprout, blossom, and bear fruit. His article took the reader on a seasonal journey from the first spring flowers to witch hazel's winter blossoms that you see here. Flagg also expressed his ecological vision in poetry, such as this piece, in which he contrasts a cricket's joy in life with humanity's unfortunate tendency to work too hard for the sake of financial gain. Flagg urged people to learn new precepts from our insect siblings, and thus live every season gladly. Wilson Flagg was especially fond of what are called picturesque landscapes. These are very different from sublime landscapes like Niagara Falls or Yosemite. In 19th century aesthetic theory, the picturesque and the sublime are two variations on aesthetic beauty. While a beautiful landscape has the order and harmony of a French nobleman's garden, a sublime landscape is so large and inhuman that it inspires dread. But a picturesque landscape is humble, human-scaled. It might lack intrinsic beauty, but still remind us of something that inspires sympathy or pleasure. To make the contrast, Flagg described the two sides of Mount Holyoke in western Massachusetts. On one side, the almost boundless space inspires sublime awe. On the other, the farms of the Connecticut Valley awaken our interest and fix our attention. The inventors of America's national parks, people like John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt, cared mostly for the sublime. For them, the absence of people was what made a landscape worth protecting. That had two big problems. First, it justified the expulsion of indigenous communities from the sublime landscapes designated for environmental protection. And that didn't just happen in the 19th century, by the way. Western environmentalists continue to cause it to happen in the national parks of Africa. Second, the creation of national parks often absolved Americans from the responsibility for caring about biodiversity closer to home. We might spray pesticides on a manicured lawn, for example, before driving a gas-guzzling car to a vacation in Yellowstone. Wilson Flagg noticed this problem more than 150 years ago, chastising New England travelers for loving the White Mountains better than their own backyards. Flagg's alternative environmentalism literally begins in the backyard. He urged people to plant trees alongside roads and especially on hilltops, where they would offer an appealing shelter from the wind. Observing the comfort of sheep grazing on a wooded hillside, he suggested that every scene be made more comfortable both to human beings and the creatures under our protection. Noticing that forests are cooler in summer and warmer in winter than bare fields, he warned that a deforested continent would likely have harsher and drier weather. In 1856, Flagg wrote one of the first proposals for a system of large-scale forest parks in metropolitan Boston. Addressing himself to state and city governments, he suggested that each city purchase 1,000 acres or more of wooded land to be kept as a preserve and to be used as a place for the study of natural history and summer recreation. By comparison, New York Central Park, which had not yet been created, is 843 acres. Such a park would be in a wild and uncultivated spot with a great diversity of surface and at least one water body. It would be preserved from age to age in its primitive state of wildness. Some of the reasons Flagg gave for forest preserves verged on what we might call deep ecology. Decades before big game hunters organized to preserve western wildernesses, Flagg gave free voice to his personal antipathy to hunting. Hope I'm not stepping on too many toes here. The life of every creature, with the exception of certain offensive animals, should be held sacred within the limits of these grounds. It should be considered a misdemeanor to kill a bird or a squirrel or any other inoffensive animal that makes its dwelling here. So this is not a plea for wildness in the usual sense. In the absence of hunters, he supposed that wild birds would become very tame and companionable and thus easier to study. Forest preserves would thus be educational spaces as well as asylums for animals. Flagg hoped that these forest schools would be radically democratic. Even the, quote, humblest clerk or apprentice could afford the train fare to a forest preserve. There they'd find marble tablets, we don't quite use marble nowadays, with poetic inscriptions and information about natural history. Flagg also thought it would be possible for farmers to graze some sheep or cows without harming the wildlife. These animals, he wrote, would provide a picturesque appendage to the landscape, and by proper care would not interfere with the growth of indigenous plants. So notice he's trying to harmonize greater biodiversity with actual human uses. At the same time, Flagg thought that parks in a state of primitive wildness would be cheap to maintain. All that would be needed would be to plant trees in the naked areas and create grass paths. Rather optimistically, Flagg predicted that the borders of the paths would fill with wildflowers. As any user of Boston's metropolitan parks knows, wildflowers are not absent, but may be crowded out by poison ivy and invasive species that also thrive in disrupted borders. That's what's being called attention to with that sign right there. He also failed to anticipate the considerable expense that municipalities and park authorities would devote early in the 20th century to protecting forests from moth infestation. More importantly, he missed a logical inference from his own picturesque theory that human interest and sympathy, even expressed in the willingness to be taxed, might ultimately be better for the landscape than the indifferent neglect that would befall many preserved lands in the age of the automobile. Flagg sometimes gives credit as the first person to call specifically for the preservation of Middlesex Fells. But it appears that in 1856, his walks from Cambridge hadn't yet taken him to the fells. The location he had in mind at that time was Bartlemy's Pond in South Danvers, close to his hometown. 16 years later, he wrote an updated proposal that focused on what he called, quote, the hilly and barren tract, still partially covered with forest, lying in Stoneham and Medford, called the 5 Mile Wood. That's the fells. Soon thereafter, he befriended Eliza Wright, who was still remembered as the father of the fells, and who was, I believe, actually the first person to recommend a park in that location. Given the depth of their friendship, I doubt either one of them would care who gets credit for being first. Eliza Wright's lifespan coincided almost perfectly with Wilson Flagg's, and both had ancestors who walked along the Charles River, perhaps together, as early as 1630. In other respects, they followed different paths to environmental activism. Wright was born in the woods of northwestern Connecticut, spent his youth in Ohio, before coming to Boston to edit an abolitionist newspaper in the 1840s. While Flagg devoted his whole life to reflection on forests, Wright had so many different activist causes over his lifetime that his work for Middlesex Fells appears almost as a footnote in his standard scholarly biography. That biography, as you can see, is titled Abolitionist Actuary Atheist, because Wright made his mark first in the fight against slavery, then as a reformer of life insurance, and then as a champion of religious freedom. Wright's mix of causes is important because environmentalism is always impoverished when it is separated from concern for human communities. Wright never made that mistake. In fact, his first call for a forest park, published in 1847, was shaped by the confluence of abolitionist and labor activism at that time. Its abolitionist ally, Gerrit Smith, had inherited a fortune from his land-speculating father, and as a result was criticized by working-class radicals who said it was hypocritical to oppose slavery while holding a monopoly on farmland. Gerrit Smith decided his critics were right and began distributing his land to small farmers, both black and white. He and Eliza Wright then called on the government to distribute western lands to urban workers in small parcels of about 160 acres. This would eventually lead to the Homestead Act, but the original idea was much more extreme. The homesteads Wright had in mind would have restricted titles, making them exempt from seizure for debt, and they could only be sold to other landless farmers. Wright envisioned dense neighborhoods of homesteads in the Midwest, with lands further west preserved for indigenous communities. He observed that small farmers, not big farmers, would have the time to improve the soil with intensive manuring. This was a rebuttal to the then common practice of acquiring as much land as possible, working it to depletion, and then moving further west. Scattered among Wright's many articles on land reform was a short piece inspired by the creation of Forest Hill Cemetery in Boston that called for a new sort of park. It would be larger in scale than existing parks and managed only minimally, for nature is what we want to get at. Since Boston Common could not accommodate a growing population, Wright suggested the city could acquire a square mile of mountain land between 5 and 10 miles from the center. At the time, Wright imagined that such a park would be located in the Blue Hills to the south of Boston. What this proposal had in common with Wright's land reform advocacy was the idea of a democratically managed public domain. By the 1840s, the federal government had a long-standing tradition of stealing indigenous lands and turning them over to land speculators or else using them for canals and other public works that primarily benefited merchants and industrialists. Eliza Wright opposed all that. He wanted the government to act only for the public benefit expressed in parks and homesteads. And he wanted to pay for it with an honest direct property tax that would shift the burdens of government from labor to capital. 20 years later, Wright himself did have enough capital to purchase his own little homestead at the base of Pine Hill in Medford. Wright's land is now occupied by Interstate 93, including the spot on the highway from which you can observe Wright's Tower on top of Pine Hill. From the top of the hill, before the tower was there, of course, Wright realized that the fells might be a suitable location for a forest park as the Blue Hills, and thus the forest campaign began in earnest in 1869. This was a time when Boston's landscape was changing rapidly. Landfill had turned the back bay of the Charles River into a luxury neighborhood. As Bostonians began dreaming of what would become the Emerald Necklace, Wright proposed something much bigger. What is wanted is not a local breathing hole like our common, he said at one hearing, but a park large enough to accommodate the population of the future. To achieve such a park, Boston would need to cooperate with other municipalities and take advantage of the new railroads. Even a 2,000-acre park could be as accessible as the Commons if it was on a trolley line. Such a park, Wright wrote, would be capable of being made a museum for the study of every branch of natural history, as well as an attractive retreat into the domain of wild nature herself. Yet Wright, like Flagg, was hardly a wilderness purist. He thought the reforestation of hilltops could be accelerated by bringing mud up from the flats of the Mystic River. When it became clear that Bostonians were not inclined to tax themselves for parks beyond the city limits, Wright began brainstorming alternative pathways to regional parks in the 1870s. He took the idea of regional parks and built a movement of people to create them. The movement was never huge, but Wright brought together people with very different motives for saving the forest. These were not single-issue environmentalists, but people who cared about clean water, fire prevention, civic pride, remembering their ancestors, preventing climate change, following the latest scientific developments, and honoring the personhood of the trees. Wright touched on all of these themes in the dozens of essays he wrote for Middlesex Fells. His first appeal was to his neighbors. Dozens of wealthy and not-so-wealthy people owned the land he hoped to turn into a park. Since many had houses just outside what would be the park borders, he tried to convince them that they would enjoy living next to a park and their property values might go up. The 5 surrounding towns, he said, could create a joint board under a state charter. At the same time, Wright tried to interest people who lived further away by offering to take them on, quote, a ramble of 4 or 5 miles in pretty rough ways, with abundant geological and botanical information. I know some of you take people on those rambles today. Oops, this was not where I wanted to be. Okay, I think I'm missing a slide. I won't worry about that. Wright also built on 19th century New Englanders' fascination with their ancestors. He often told the story of how Middlesex Fells had been explored by John Winthrop and a few companions in 1831. They had given Spot Pond its name because of the rocky island in the middle, and it had a meal of cheese on top of Bear Hill because they'd forgot to pack bread. Wright noted that the name Bear Hill took on new meaning in the era of deforestation and proposed that it be renamed for Winthrop. Luckily, that didn't stick, or else we'd have to be talking about whether a notorious enslaver and perpetrator of genocide deserves to have a hill named for him. Eliza Wright's advocacy included many of the core ideas of climate activists today. Now, it's always risky for a historian to say that anything is first. Wright was definitely not the first to warn of climate change, but he may have been the first to build a movement to try to prevent it. Again and again, he warned his neighbors of what might happen if water and carbon cycles were disrupted by the cutting of trees or the burning of coal. water and carbon cycles. He built on George Barrell Emerson's careful explanation of how deforestation would disrupt the water cycle, gradually turning North America into a desert, and added his own worry that deforestation would also disrupt the carbon cycle, changing the composition of the air so much as to make it unbreathable. So notice, Wright agitated around rising carbon levels without recognizing the specific greenhouse mechanism that makes us worried about atmospheric carbon today. It's a little bit ironic that Wright did not know about the greenhouse effect because it was discovered decades earlier by New Yorker Eunice Foote, who moved in the same abolitionist circles as Wright. But she was a chemist, not an ecologist. She didn't realize that human activity might change the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and thus change the climate. Credit for putting the greenhouse effect with human activity goes to Svante Arrhenius, whose research on ice ages helped him make the connection a few years after Wright died. Now, even though Wright got the mechanism wrong, I think that actually makes his argument more ecologically significant. What he recognized most clearly was that in an interconnected world, changes that initially involve only one part of the whole, such as trees or coal, will eventually extend out to touch everything. To my knowledge, the first time Wright spoke about the carbon cycle was also the first of the forest festivals he held to promote a Middlesex Fells Park. On October 15, 1880, he observed that the complementarity of vegetable and animal life was a well-established scientific fact. Our health depends, he continued, on pure air, and trees are the greatest purifiers because they absorb the carbon and restore to the air the oxygen essential to the life of animals. The destruction of a single healthy tree, Wright said, would shorten some human life. If all the forests were destroyed, quote, mankind would smother in the poison of their own breath. At another forest festival, 2 years later, Wright put this argument about the carbon cycle in the context of evolutionary history. Even more than other animals, Wright claimed, humans need to breathe an atmosphere of pure oxygen. For this reason, the saurian monsters, there you have them, might have been able to breathe, quote, before the first gigantic forest growths had absorbed carbon out of the atmosphere, making the vast coal formations. But humans would not have survived in such an environment. And likewise, they wouldn't be able to survive, quote, if they burn up the coal at the rate of 280 million tons a year and destroy the forests. Humanity has a sacred obligation, Wright concluded, to ensure that 1/4 of the Earth's surface remains forested. Obviously, Wright was familiar with the evolutionary theories of Charles Darwin. He was also familiar with a speech that Darwin's colleague Thomas Huxley had made in honor of the earlier scientist Joseph Priestley. Priestley was the first to isolate oxygen from the atmosphere, Huxley noted. Huxley said, and Wright agreed, that Priestley had made the most important scientific discovery of all time when he showed that plants and animals depend on one another for carbon and oxygen. This shows us that Wright was interpreting Darwin in ecological terms. The essential discovery was not red and tooth and claw competition, but rather the interdependence of species. Wright added one more radical idea to his climate activism. He insisted that forests and individual trees had intrinsic value whether or not they were useful to humans. Wilson Flagg felt the same way, so did Henry David Thoreau, but many other conservationists did not. I've seen no evidence of this idea in the founding documents of either the Metropolitan Park Commission or the trustees of reservations, things that were the institutional fruits of Wright's activism. Oh, that's the slide I meant to show you earlier. It was just in the wrong place, but that's a little bit about, that's Wright's poem about Bear Hill and John Winthrop. Okay. Wright first hinted at his belief that trees are persons, when he published, quote, a petition of the big elms and buttonwoods on the mall to the Corporation of the City of Boston in September of 1847. He did it again in an 1883 essay entitled The Voice of a Tree from the Middlesex Fells. In this piece, a white pine directly addresses a human audience, speaking not for myself alone, but for all my kind, to your kind, for the vegetable to the animal world. The tree makes a joke about its Linnaean name, suggesting that Pinus strobus inspired the invention of the wheel because of the spoke-like pattern of its branches. It then whispers into its reader's ear that our food is your poison, as a prelude to an explanation about the carbon cycle. The pine concludes by explaining the need for forest parks. Now, at one level, this is just a funny way to make his point. But Wright really wanted his readers to think about whether trees are persons. Answering the objection that trees cannot feel and have no consciousness of the harm done to them, Pinus strobus replies, but how do you know that? How do you know that? Have you ever been a tree yourself? By highlighting the fact that we cannot know for sure, Wright suggested that it might be wise to give tree personhood the benefit of the doubt. The most important thing about Wright was his commitment to mass mobilization, a legacy of his days as an abolitionist. His forest festivals combined the practices of what we today would call citizen science and climate activism. The forest festivals were large-scale gatherings designed to enlist hundreds of neighbors in the cause. As Wright explained at the first festival, we want a plan wide enough to interest everybody and bring everybody face-to-face with nature. The third festival, on June 17, 1882, exemplified the strategy. It was jointly sponsored by the Essex Institute, what became the Peabody Essex Museum, and a short-lived Middlesex Institute. In the previous year, members of the Middlesex Institute had conducted excursions through the area, collecting data for a catalog of local flora. On the day of the festival, hundreds of people turned out for pleasant rambles, observing the many species at the base of Bear Hill. They then climbed to the summit, where Medford schoolteacher Lauren Lodame, president of the Middlesex Institute, welcomed the visitors from Essex. George Davenport read a poem called Dame Nature's Greeting. A visitor from Salem described the local trees, and a visitor from Kentucky described the trees in his state. Harvard professor Asa Gray offered some reflections on Darwinian evolution and on his own meeting with Darwin. In his speech, Eliza Wright invited these citizen scientists to become climate activists as well. He reminded his audience once again that it's a law of nature that the animal life of this planet depends upon the vegetable, man's upon the tree. That sacred balance was being disrupted. He buttressed his argument with complex calculations. He had been a math professor at one point, about the carbon stored in trees and coal. He linked his environmentalism to social justice, suggesting that urban laborers would suffocate unless they had access to pine forests within a few minutes' ride of their factories and neighborhoods. And he hoped that an annual observance of the Forest Festival would keep his vision alive. Alas, both Wright and the festivals had just a few years left to live. But in those few years, they bore good fruit. The Public Domain Act of 1882, also known as the Forest Law, enabled towns and cities to hold forested or reforesting parcels of land, acquired by donation or purchase or eminent domain. Though this legislation was the direct result of Wright and Flagg's agitation on behalf of Middlesex Fells, it didn't lead directly to the preservation of Middlesex Fells. The challenge of getting 5 towns to preserve the forest together was a little bit too steep. So the first fruit of the new forest law was Lynn Woods. There you go. 2,200 acres of forests and lakes that continues to be the second largest municipal park in the United States. Other towns followed suit on a smaller scale. In In Melrose, the children of Eliza Wright's friend Samuel Sewell donated their family homestead with the provision that none of the trees on said premises shall be cut down unless decayed, or that it shall be considered necessary to do so for the benefit of the remaining trees. And here in Winchester, the Brooks Parkhurst Town Forest was acquired in 1941 in accordance with the same law. Then, in 1893, the Metropolitan Park Act created a statewide board to care for a coordinated network of parks throughout the metropolitan area, especially those that straddled town boundaries. So this is in direct response to the challenge with Middlesex Fells. This legislation ensured the preservation of most of the large natural areas that are easily accessible to metropolitan Bostonians today. Not only the rock hills of Middlesex Fells, but also those of the Blue Hills, much of the Atlantic shoreline, and the banks of the three major rivers connecting the shoreline to the hills, the Mystic, the Charles, and the Neponset. More than 6,000 acres of land was directly preserved as a result, none of it so-called virgin forest, but all of it ripe for reforestation. Shortly before this momentous event, the trustees of reservations had emerged from the Appalachian Mountain Club as a nonprofit organization devoted to preserving, quote, such scenes and sites in Massachusetts as possess either uncommon beauty or historical interest. The trustees created the paradigm for subsequent land trust organizations, such as the Massachusetts Audubon Society, that added to the acreage of preserved land. The Metropolitan Park System, likewise, was the template for state parks across the nation, and thus for the remarkable reforestation of the eastern United States. Because of this legislation, in part, Massachusetts today is more than 60% forested. But with those successes came the seeds of complacency. In 1885, the last year of his life, Eliza Wright hosted the final Forest Festival and also welcomed the National Forestry Congress to Boston. When the new Metropolitan Park Commission took ownership of the fells 8 years later, they relied more heavily on the professionals of the Forestry Congress than on the citizens of the forest festivals to preserve the trees. As state-appointed experts took control of the forests, citizen activists took a step back. Eliza Wright's daughter Ellen was a notable exception. She repeatedly castigated the park commissioners for their compromises in what she regarded as excessive interventions that did not honor nature's capacity to heal itself. But other friends of the forest ceded the ground literally to the professionals. The creation of the National Park System in 1916 also had the unintended consequence of leading many Americans to view forest preservation as something to be delegated to a large official body of the federal government, rather than as something that requires ordinary citizens to take responsibility for their backyard woods. Around the same time, the professional managers of urban and suburban parks began prioritizing sports and active recreation, rather than activities that would help ordinary people connect with nature. Yet another blow to the legacy of the 19th century conservationists was the advent of automotive recreation. Road trips to Yosemite could not prevent the catastrophic deforestation of the American West. With cars rendering citizen environmentalists mere spectators of passing scenery, local forests suffered. Interstate 93 was built directly through Middlesex Fells. Large segments of the Charles River that had been protected by the 1893 law became dumping grounds. There were few activists in the first two-thirds of the 20th century to protest these desecrations, and the link between forest preservation, a healthy climate, and social justice was all but forgotten for a century. Fortunately, what's forgotten can be remembered, and the spirit of the Forest Festival is very much alive today. Friends of the Fells work with government leaders to ensure that increased recreation does not threaten preservation. Earthwise Aware encourages volunteers to collect data on the changing cycles of trees, insects, and amphibians the better to track biodiversity. The Mystic River Watershed Association, growing rapidly in its 50th year, invites neighbors of all backgrounds to count migrating herring or remove invasive plants. Countless individuals take personal responsibility for a treasured patch of woods by removing trash or protesting against encroaching development. And as I walked through these spaces, I was again and again seeing little plaques to the person in the 1970s or the 1990s who had finally taken active concern in lands that had been neglectfully preserved for the previous century. As we reconnect with our disrupted and beautiful planet, we are called to find our own ways of taking action. By making every day a forest festival, we can build a new century of continuous activism. Thank you. And we've got some time for questions. And I'd love to hear also, I know that many of you have a lot of knowledge of pieces of the story that I may have left out, and certainly welcome additions to the story as well as questions. Yeah.
I noticed that one of your earlier slides when you showed the Indians and the tree and the white pine was focused, and of course it's not a white pine tree, that would had to be a spruce or a fir or something because the branching structure is.
You know, that's really interesting. So the artist is the same Oren Lyons who promoted the seventh generation thing. And I did, I was wondering about that and thinking, do they grow differently in different contexts? But it certainly is the case that white pine is the symbol of the Haudenosaunee Confederation, and he was doing that to sort of exemplify this. So I have to take it up with him. Yeah.
When people were involved with the forest festivals, what kind of numbers were there? How many?
Yeah, I don't have a super good picture of that. Certainly there were hundreds at the one that I had a proper kind of newspaper account of. The funny thing about that newspaper account, it told about everybody's speech except Eliza Wright's. I have Eliza Wright's from the collection of his writings that his daughter published. So yeah, I'm still working to track down more information. But we are talking of a movement of hundreds rather than of thousands, I think. Yeah.
One person that really helped carry the ball to the right was Sylvester Baxter, who actually named themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, so Baxter is really interesting character who I haven't fully gotten to. Part of what motivated me to take this up was that I already knew about Wright through my work on abolitionist history. I already knew about Charles Eliot, the landscape architect who was kind of despised by Ellen Wright because of my work on Unitarian history, and I knew about Sylvester Baxter because of my interest in intentional communities, because he was also one of the big promoters of the utopian vision of Edward Bellamy, the book Looking Backward. So I'm still trying to figure out all the different pieces that Sylvester Baxter put together in his love of forests. But in the generation after Wright, yes, he definitely is in the same spirit of kind of multi-issue activist who came to see Middlesex Fells as part of that vision. Yeah.
My brother some years ago gave me a book, Michael Rawson's Eating on the Charles, The Making of Boston, which is more than just an environmental history, but had a chapter on Middlesex, which I didn't read prior to coming here. But do you have kind of a recommended reading list for just kind of environmental history, not just of Middlesex, but of Greater Boston?
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you thinking of putting your material together in some kind of publication?
Yeah, this is kind of a slow boat project, and honestly, some of you had seen the little piece I did in the Boston Globe last spring, and I imagined there would be a lot more progress on it between then and giving this talk, which there really wasn't. This academic year proved a little more challenging than I planned. But honestly, though, this practice of walking all these spaces and seeing what I notice has led me down a whole bunch of paths that still need to be fleshed out. Particularly the relationship between park creation and the creation of large-scale institutions for people with mental illnesses or intellectual disabilities that were initially very idealistic and became very harmful. Pretty much everywhere you see a park, you also see one of these institutions. And I'm trying to understand the intertwining of worldviews among the people who are creating them both. Yeah.
There's some broad, maybe you're formulating them ideas about what we all do with a world in which there's so much development. We're in it, and we own these homes, and we own these houses, and at a time like this is when you look at an assessor's map, for example, you see every little parcel, and you see the footprint of every little house, and then you see these little zones that are green because those are the public lands. We've got a nice Brooks Park, Parker's the forest, and we've got actually there's this very small parcel that was put into an organization called Winchester Tomorrow, and that is for those in here between Lawson and Leicester Road, and it's overseen by an independent nonprofit. It's small, but it exists, and that was probably done in the 90s. But where else do you see metropolitan Boston going in communities that are built up as this one?
Yeah. So I think before doing this work, I probably would have thought, mostly in terms of smart transit development, of having very dense, development right around transit stations, which is definitely part of it. But I think this work does also make me think, and other people probably know more about how to do this practically, because this is just a thought in my head, that anyone with a real yard, should be thinking about how to manage your yard in such a way as to make it ecologically connected to the larger parks in your vicinity. I really thought about this when I went to Sewell Woods in Melrose, because it's a small parcel. It's just this family's home basically, but it's kind of midway. It's on the route that you would take if you were going from Middlesex Fells to Lynn Woods. And it made me think, okay, how can we think about the interconnections of these spaces so that an animal can make its way along this, or various plant species can sort of not be interrupted in their spread along the corridors.
I have a question. You said that Baxter named the fells, and I always thought fells in its old Saxon word, meaning that's what I've been told, rocky windblown hills.
Yeah, you were told that by Baxter. I assume the etymology is authentic, but the idea of attaching that name to this particular forest kind of came about through Sylvester Baxter in his role as a newspaperman, taking an interest in what Wright and Flagg were doing.
Baxter didn't invent the word. No, the word existed for hundreds of years, maybe thousands, yeah.
The phrase Middlesex Fells is what's being invented.
Fells.
Yeah.
There are some
some other things. When, in the history, and when it was first developed, were there frictions like that that maybe were similar or different, or?
Yeah, okay. So now I'm going to really get myself into trouble. Yeah, let me see if I can put together my thinking on this. So Baxter was a great bicycle man. These are the early days of the bicycle, and part of this boulevard idea, which was part of this original plan, was to promote bicycle recreation. Not bicycle recreation of the sort that we think about now, mountain bikes going up over the steep parts, but 19th century bikes going on pathways that allowed a lot of exposure to nature. And with the invention of the automobile, these park boulevards were the right-of-ways you needed to move a lot of cars through the metropolitan region. So that piece of it got lost. The current politics around bikes and dogs are interesting. I will admit that I am a hiker who is a little bit scared of dogs. And so I can be one of the people who is sad if dog walkers are not super attentive to what their animals are doing. But as I've walked through all of the spaces that were preserved in the 1890s, and this means not only through the fells and through Blue Hills, but also all the way along the Charles from the mouth to, I think I've got as far as Dedham in various trips. What I've noticed is that the vast majority of people who use the space that was preserved are either joggers or dog walkers. That is clearly the numerically, hikers are a small little group compared to those others. And so I really hope that hikers would be the most politically mobilized to preserve this legacy, right? But I really hope that hikers can find better strategies for enlisting dog owners and joggers as allies, because the constituency that cares is much larger if all those folks are part of it.
But I don't think historically.
Any more?
Questions?
Okay.
That is a wrap.
All right. Thank you all so much.
I'm just going to say a few words. If we haven't met, let me introduce myself. My name is Electra Gavoni, and I'm actually the new president of the Winchester Historic
Oh,
Society.
congratulations.
So welcome. This has been our first in-person event in a long time, and let me tell you, we're very, very happy to have everyone here enjoying this lovely home and have a wonderful topic and discussion and just be together. And so it's wonderful to see you. I want to thank our program committee. Hilda is our chair. We also have Laurie and Carol and Courtney here. They come up with these fantastic ideas and find these wonderful speakers, and so we're so appreciative of that. And this is actually a part of kind of a broader festival. So Hilda is also chairing the Winchester Cultural District. So why don't you take a second and talk about a little bit bigger of the Waterfield Festival.
Sure. So, given that it is April, it is Earth Month, we have Ken here having tonight's wonderful program. And we're also partnering with the Conservation Commission, so it is our this year, the Cultural District has commissioned 2 pieces of artwork to be placed at 500 Main Street. It is a herring and a heron. Both, yes, exactly. Both local animals. And we asked the artists to find the materials. So they found scrap metal to create these 2 sculptures. They are vessels, and we're going to fill them with plastic. In other words, we clean up, we're putting in them. So it's really a depiction of what these local animals who live in our community and what they're ingesting. So that's the exhibit. It'll be up for 2 months, and then we'll roll into the photo mill exhibit, which will start up in the June time period. So please come and see the pieces. August Wessner is one of the artists. He lives here in Winchester, and Stephanie Timmerman is the second artist as well, and she's local. She lives up in Lynn. But thank you for coming tonight, and I hope you get a chance to see the artwork for the rest of the year.
Yes. Our next program is going to be here on May 10th. It's going to be it's Who Are the Sachems of the Mystic, and it's actually who was Squaw Sachem. And so it's actually 2 high school students who approached us interested in history. We know that there's been the notion of sachems and what's changed at the high school, and they really wanted to talk about the history and who were the people who lived here and bring that forth. And so we're super excited to have them. And one, it's like, oh, high school people interested in history. Yay! Bring your friends. But that's going to be here on the 10th, and I hope you can make it. It's going to be wonderful. And once again, it's wonderful seeing everyone here. We are the Historic Society. If you're not a member, consider joining. The more, the merrier. There's always lovely opportunities to get involved, and we are a nonprofit. So we have project after project. Some of them involve keeping this house as beautiful as it is. And so, yeah, remember us. If you have a few shekels to send out. But thank you all once again. I hope we have more coffee, there's more cookies. And so please stay and have a conversation and enjoy yourself a little bit more. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So,
Yeah, I think that's in the files. I can't remember for sure.